In the summer of 1518, the streets of Strasbourg filled with music, but there were no celebrations. Instead, people moved like puppets, their bodies jerking and twisting, unable to stop. They danced until their feet bled, until their bones broke, until their hearts gave out, collapsing lifeless on the cobblestones. This was not a festival. It was not joy. It was terror. A dancing plague that gripped hundreds and left a city in horror. What force could make people dance themselves to death? And why did no one, no priest, no doctor, no ruler, manage to stop it? This is the true story of one of history's strangest and most terrifying events. The dancing plague of 1518. In a city already weakened by famine and fear, a single woman stepped into the streets and began to dance. What started as one body became dozens, then hundreds, all trapped in a nightmare where movement never ended. Some danced for days, some danced for weeks, and many never rose again. Tonight, we will uncover how an entire city lost control of its own bodies, the desperate attempts to cure the madness, and the horrifying theories that still haunt historians to this day. Stay with me until the very end, because the explanation is even more chilling than the event itself. And before we dive in, hit that like button, subscribe for more dark history, and share your thoughts in the comments. Now, let us step back into Strasbourg 1518, where the dance of death began. The year was 1518. The city of Strasbourg, part of the Holy Roman Empire, simmered under a cruel summer sun. The air was heavy with heat and heavier still with despair. Crops had failed, famine gnawed at the bellies of the poor, and disease stalked the streets like a silent predator. The people prayed for mercy, but it seemed heaven had turned its face away. Strasbourg was a city of stone and shadow. Narrow alleys reeked of sweat and smoke, its markets filled with weary faces. Merchants counted their coins with trembling hands, while beggars stretched out palms that never seemed to be filled. Priests urged repentance, warning of sins that had angered God. And all around, the whispers of fear grew louder. Fear of hunger, fear of plague, fear of war. But in the heart of this misery, another storm was about to break. A storm stranger, darker, and far more terrifying than any sword or sickness. It would not come in silence but in rhythm. It would not strike with a blade, but with footsteps pounding against cobblestones. No one in Strasbourg could have imagined that their suffering would soon take the shape of music, without joy, movement, without reason. In this city already torn by despair, something unexplainable was waiting, something that would haunt its streets forever. It began with one woman, one step, one dance, and from that single moment, Strasbourg would descend into chaos unlike anything the world had ever seen. It began on an ordinary day, in the sweltering heat of July 1518. A woman known as Frau Trophäa stepped into the narrow streets of Strasbourg. Neighbours watched as she moved into the open, her face pale, her body trembling. Then, she began to dance. At first, some believed she was mocking, perhaps drunk, or simply entertaining herself. But this was no performance. There was no music, no festival, no laughter. Her movements were frantic, wild and strange, arms flailing, feet stamping, sweat dripping from her brow. Hour after hour she continued, even as her body screamed in exhaustion. The sun dipped low, and the cobblestones beneath her feet grew hot, but still she moved. By nightfall, she collapsed from sheer fatigue. Yet the next morning, she returned to the street and began again. For days she could not stop. She danced until her feet bled, until her body shook, until her strength abandoned her. The townsfolk gathered in crowds, some horrified, some fascinated. Mothers pulled their children close, priests made the sign of the cross, and whispers spread like fire. Was she cursed, possessed, punished by God? But soon, the horror deepened. What began with Frau Trophäa did not stay with her. One by one, others joined her, as though her madness was a flame, and their bodies were dry straw, catching fire in an instant. And within weeks, Strasbourg would not be a city of silence and prayer. It would be a city of dancers, hundreds of them, trapped in a nightmare of endless motion. At first, the people pitied Frau Trophäa. They thought her misfortune was hers alone, a strange illness, a curse perhaps. But soon something unthinkable happened. Within a week, others began to join her. One man, then another, a woman, then a child. It was as if the sight of her frantic movements had unlocked something deep inside them, something that could not be contained. By the end of the second week, the streets of Strasbourg were filled with dancers. Dozens moved without reason, their feet slamming against the stones, their arms swinging wildly, their eyes glazed with exhaustion. They danced through the day, through the night, collapsing only to rise again, as though invisible strings pulled them back into motion. The crowd swelled so large that markets ground to a halt. Merchants abandoned their stalls to stare. Priests prayed louder in their pulpits, and mothers clutched their children in terror. This was no entertainment, no festival. It was madness. The sound of hundreds of feet stamping in unison echoed through the streets like drums of war. Some tried to hold the dancers down, but it was useless. Their bodies writhed free, as if possessed by some unholy force. The city's cobblestones grew slick with blood from split feet. Shirts clung to skin drenched in sweat. The smell of desperation hung heavy in the summer air. Strasbourg had become a city of dancers. No music, no joy, only agony. And as the numbers grew, so did the fear. For if dozens could not stop themselves, what would happen when hundreds were taken by the dance? By the third week, Strasbourg was no longer a city of prayers and markets. It was a city possessed. What had begun with one woman now consumed hundreds. Entire streets pulsed with bodies jerking and swaying, their bare feet slamming the cobblestones, leaving streaks of blood in their wake. The summer sun bore down relentlessly, turning the stone roads into burning plates. Yet the dancers did not stop. They spun until dizziness dropped them to the ground, only to rise moments later, as though some invisible force dragged them back to their feet. Their faces were twisted with exhaustion, mouths foaming, eyes staring blankly ahead. This was not joy. This was torment. Day blurred into night, and still the movements continued. Torches lit the streets where dancers writhed in shadows. Neighbors could not sleep, the sound of stamping feet echoing through every alley. Strasbourg had become a nightmare without rest, without reason. Bodies began to break under the strain. Ribs cracked from violent convulsions. Legs snapped under endless pounding. Hearts gave out from exhaustion. And yet the survivors continued, some collapsing lifeless in the streets, others twitching on the ground, still trying to move even as death approached. The people looked on in terror, too afraid to join, too helpless to intervene. Priests whispered of demons, doctors spoke of blood running too hot, and mothers covered their children's eyes. But no explanation mattered in the face of what they saw. An entire city dancing itself into death, and still the madness spread, swallowing more with each passing day. Strasbourg was no longer living in fear of hunger or plague. It was living in fear of its own cursed rhythm. The dancers were no longer people. They were prisoners of their own bodies. Their feet split open, bleeding freely onto the cobblestones, leaving red trails through the streets. Blisters swelled, then burst, only to be torn open again with every frantic step. The smell of blood mixed with sweat hung thick in the air, a reminder that this was no dance of joy. It was a dance of agony. Their bodies groaned under the strain. Some collapsed gasping, their ribs fractured from violent spasms. Others convulsed on the ground, limbs twitching as though pulled by invisible strings, then staggered upright once more to continue their torment. Even when their eyes rolled back in their skulls, even when foam poured from their mouths, the dance did not end. Witnesses described scenes too horrifying to forget. Mothers dancing with newborns in their arms until both collapsed. Old men moving until their hearts burst. Children stumbling on bloody feet until they lay still on the stones. Doctors tried to hold them down, but the bodies thrashed violently, as if something inside refused release. Priests declared that demons possessed the dancers, and that only death would free them. To onlookers it seemed true, for the dance continued beyond reason, beyond pain, beyond the limits of flesh. Each collapse brought silence for a moment, but it was always broken by the stamping of more feet. Strasbourg had become a city of broken bones and bleeding bodies, yet the nightmare refused to end, and as more dancers fell lifeless in the streets, the question grew louder in every heart. What unholy power was forcing these people to dance themselves into death? As the days bled into weeks, panic gripped Strasbourg. The city that once bustled with trade and prayer now throbbed with terror. Officials gathered in chambers thick with candle smoke, their voices trembling as they argued. What was happening to their people? Was it sickness, a curse, or the devil himself walking their streets? The mayor, desperate for answers, called upon physicians, but the doctors could not agree. Some declared it an illness of the blood, too hot, too wild, driving bodies into madness. Others insisted it was a punishment from God for sins left unrepented. The priests, faces pale, nodded gravely, urging the people to pray harder, to beg forgiveness. But the dancers kept moving. No medicine stopped them. No prayer slowed their feet. And every day more were claimed. Fear spread faster than the plague itself. Merchants abandoned the market, unwilling to trade in a city cursed by madness. Families locked their doors, whispering prayers by candlelight as the sound of stamping echoed outside. Mothers feared their children might be next, while husbands dragged wives away from crowds, afraid a single glimpse might draw them into the frenzy. The council faced a choice: to see this as divine wrath or to treat it as disease. Their indecision only fueled the panic. Some urged for exorcisms, others for stricter laws, while a few even suggested fleeing the city altogether. Strasbourg was no longer a city of order, it was a city of dread. Its leaders watched helplessly as their people destroyed themselves. And the one question haunted every corner: how could anyone stop what no one seemed to control? The Council of Strasbourg, desperate and bewildered, made a decision that would haunt them. If the people could not stop dancing, then perhaps the cure was more dancing. They reasoned that forcing the sickness out of their bodies through movement would break the curse. And so, they built a massive wooden stage in the center of the city. Musicians were hired, drums and fiddles filled the air, and professional dancers were even called in to guide the madness. The sound of music rolled through the streets as hundreds swayed and convulsed, their bodies jerking in rhythm with the instruments. To the city's leaders, it seemed a solution. To the people, it was hell-given melody. The music only fueled the frenzy. The dancers moved harder, faster, their bleeding feet pounding against the stage, their cries drowned out by the instruments meant to heal them. Crowds gathered in horror as men and women collapsed lifeless on the boards, only to be replaced by more bodies caught in the rhythm. The city had hoped to cure the plague of dancing. Instead, they gave it a stage and an orchestra to play it deeper into madness. The experiment quickly turned into a nightmare. The music that was meant to cure the dancers only drove them further into frenzy. Drums thundered, fiddles screamed, and the stamping of hundreds of broken feet echoed like thunder through Strasbourg's narrow streets. Bodies collapsed in waves. Men clutched their chests as their hearts gave out mid-step. Women fell to the ground with legs too shattered to rise again. Children, pale and trembling, danced until their small bodies stiffened in the heat. Yet the music did not stop. The players, terrified but bound by order, kept bowing strings and striking drums as death unfolded before their eyes. The stage became a graveyard. Those who fell were dragged away, only for new victims to climb aboard, seized by the same unholy rhythm. Blood smeared the wooden boards. Sweat poured like rain. And still the madness refused to loosen its grip. The city had created a spectacle of death. From balconies and alleys, citizens watched in horror as neighbors and family members dropped lifeless under the music's spell. Strasbourg was no longer just cursed. It was performing its own funeral march. As bodies piled and the madness raged on, the church could no longer stay silent. Priests filled the pulpits with fiery sermons, their voices thundering across Strasbourg. To them, this was no illness of blood. This was punishment, a plague of sin made flesh. The dancers were not victims, they declared, but sinners dragged into torment by the wrath of God. Processions wound through the city streets. Monks carried great wooden crosses. Barefoot worshippers whipped themselves bloody, hoping their suffering would soften heaven's anger. Bells tolled endlessly, calling the faithful to prayer. Yet the stamping of the dancers drowned even the voice of the church. Some priests claimed that the dance was the work of Saint Vitus, the patron of dancers and entertainers who had cursed the people for their pride. To lift it, they urged pilgrimages, offerings, and penance. But as the prayers grew louder, so too did the horror. The dancers did not slow, their bodies did not yield, and the people of Strasbourg began to wonder if God himself had abandoned them. Leaving only centuries later, the mystery of the dancing plague still haunts historians. How could hundreds of people lose control of their bodies, moving until death claimed them? The answers remain as strange as the event itself. Some believe it was mass hysteria, an outbreak of collective madness fueled by hunger, fear, and despair. Strasbourg, already torn by famine and disease, may have collapsed under the weight of its own suffering. Minds broke and bodies followed. Others point to ergot poisoning, a deadly fungus that grows on damp rye. It can cause spasms, hallucinations, even convulsions. If the people of Strasbourg ate tainted bread, perhaps their wild dancing was nothing more than a poisoned nightmare. And then there are those who speak of faith gone mad, of religious ecstasy, visions of saints, curses of demons. Perhaps the people believed so strongly in punishment from heaven that their bodies carried it out for them. But no single theory explains it all. The truth of the dancing plague remains locked in history, as mysterious as the day it began, a city that danced itself to death and left behind only questions. The memory of the dancing plague never faded from Strasbourg. For years the people spoke of it in whispers, their voices heavy with dread. Mothers warned their children of the cursed summer when the city became a stage for death. Priests preached of it as a warning from God, a punishment that could return if sin once again ruled the land. Chroniclers wrote down the horror, their words trembling on parchment, ensuring that the story would outlive them. What they described was not merely history, it was legend. Travelers carried the tale across Europe, and soon Strasbourg was known not for its trade or its beauty, but for its nightmare of endless dancing. The city itself bore the scar. Even generations later, the thought of music and mass gatherings carried unease. What had begun with one woman's frantic steps became a symbol of fear, a reminder of how fragile the human mind and body can be under the weight of suffering. The dancing plague was no festival, no miracle. It was a haunting, and it became one of the darkest legends of the Middle Ages, proof that sometimes the strangest horrors are not imagined, but real. The dancing plague of 1518 remains one of the most chilling mysteries in history. A city already broken by famine and fear became the stage for a horror no one could explain. Hundreds danced against their will, their bodies betraying them, until death silenced their feet. We may never know the true cause. Was it poisoned bread, mass hysteria, or a curse carried by the whispers of the faithful? Whatever the answer, Strasbourg's nightmare reminds us of something darker, that history hides moments where reality itself bends, where the line between science and superstition blurs, and where horror becomes truth. Imagine standing in those streets, watching neighbors and family members dance until their hearts gave out. Imagine hearing the endless pounding of feet on stone, knowing you could be next. That is the terror that lived in Strasbourg, and the terror that still lingers in its memory. The story leaves us with one haunting question. If an entire city could lose control once, could it happen again? If this tale gripped you, make sure to like this video, share it with someone who loves dark history, and subscribe for more stories where horror and history collide. Because sometimes, the strangest nightmares are the ones history swears are true.